Today, I'm going to talk about such an existing crisis in the form of displacement of people, in particular, the plight of refugees. Based on recent reports by the United Nations, there are nearly 30 million refugees in the world. A refugee is someone who has fled war, violence, conflict, and persecution, and crossed an international border to find safety. The 1951 Refugee Convention is a key legal document and mentions that a refugee is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. Today's topic focuses on South and Southeast Asia to highlight the Rohingya refugees who fled from Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, to Bangladesh. Rohingyas are an ethnic group in Myanmar, and most of them are primarily Muslims, with a small proportion of Hindus. Although the crisis heightened in 2017, the problem has been going on for decades. Myanmar is a Buddhist majority country, and Rohingyas constitute 4.3% of the population and live in the western part of the state. The political regime in Myanmar was mostly authoritarian till 2015, when formally a democratic transition set in. The military stronghold is still present in some form or the other, and the democratic government is not favorable for Rohingyas. The government claims that the Rohingyas are not citizens. My presentation today is divided into two parts. In the first part, I did the Rohingyas, the historical background indicates that this underlying processes that transform ethnic conflict into genocide. In the second part of my presentation, I share my documentary film on the same issue. But the focus is more on understanding the human costs of conflict, hearing and seeing the first-hand accounts of refugees. While understanding the processes of ethnic conflict that displaces people and brutally victimize them, I begin with this question: why do some ethnic conflicts lead to genocide and not others? I contend that ethnic conflicts that predetermine or predict who will win the ethnic war in the long run is indicative of genocide. Let me explain how and why. Ethnic conflicts that render the victimized group incapable of retaliating in any possible way can become lethal in the long run. According to Horowitz, all conflicts based on ascriptive birth-based identity, like race, language, religion, tribe, or caste, can be called ethnic. Based on this category, conflicts can range from Buddhist and Muslims in Myanmar, which is religion-based, Blacks and whites in the United States, which is race-based, Tamils and Sinhalas in Sri Lanka, which is language-based, or intra-religion between Shias and Sunnis. Varshney makes an important distinction between ethnic violence and ethnic conflict. This is critical because not all ethnic conflicts are violent. Varshney points out that in ethnically plural societies with substantial levels of freedom of expression, some conflict between identity-based cleavages are inevitable and expected. In pluralistic democracies, for instance, when different groups exist, it will naturally produce some conflict over implementation of language, religious practices, or entry of migrant ethnic groups. However, the significant factor is to determine whether conflict is violent, or how it is perpetrated, whether it is one-sided or reciprocal. Genocide is the extreme form in the continuum of ethnic violence. Van Hanen writes that the scope of ethnic conflict, characterized by the use of coercion, extends from demonstrations, riots, strikes, destruction of property, and sabotage to attacks on persons, violent clashes between groups, arrests, killing of people, rebellions, terrorism, forceful deportation of people, ethnic guerrilla war, separatist war, ethnic civil war, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. The case of genocide, either on the horizon or in the present, largely rests on an analysis of not just recent violence, but of the collective effects of decades of state policy. In recent genocide research, scholars discuss these intricate processes of victimization and calls it cold genocide and slow motion genocide or genocide by attrition. I am interested in how this affects the victims. How do they react to this? Chalk and Jonasson argue that one of the important precursors of genocide is the perception that the victim group is not equal to and fundamentally different from the wider community. If we look at the case of Rohingyas, the systematic targeting began way back in the 1960s. In 1978, Operation Dragon King began screening, identifying, persecuting, and expelling foreigners and illegal migrants. More than 200,000 Rohingyas fled to Bangladesh due to this. This was followed by forced relocation of Rohingyas. In 1982, the citizenship law stripped the Rohingyas of citizenship and made them stateless. In 1983, National Census deleted Rohingya from the list of ethnic races in Myanmar. In 1989, the military regime initiated a citizen verification program, and the Rohingyas were persecuted again. In another round of operations in 1991, more than 250,000 Rohingyas were forced into Bangladesh as a result of human rights abuse. Between 1992 to 1994, Bangladesh authorities forcibly repatriated an estimated 50,000 Rohingyas back to Myanmar. In 2012, clashes between Buddhists and Rohingyas flared up, and more than 100,000 Rohingyas were displaced. Similar events happened in 2016 and finally resulted in the 2017 episode. Each of these events indicate a disproportionate use of violence by the perpetrators. This continues the trend of one-sided violence. When one-sided violence persists, the victims are helpless and have no power to resist. To understand the actual repercussion of such violence, I analyzed refugee accounts. During 2018, I interviewed 50 Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh refugee camps. Here I highlight 3 themes that emerged from the interview data and share some excerpts of these interviews. The purpose is to highlight the one-sided nature of violence. The first theme is how refugees speak about immediate violence that they experienced in 2017. The second theme is their understanding of the historical trajectory of violence. And the third theme is returning to Myanmar. While speaking about the immediate violence of 2017, a young man who fled from Mongdo in Myanmar spoke about the atrocities that made him and his family flee. He said, "The village of Mongdo was hijacked by the Burmese army, and gun violence ensued, and then 2 regions in Mongdo were burned down. The army took everything." This was further reiterated by another woman in her 50s, as she mentioned, "The army was very violent. My husband was severely beaten up while fishing, These types of accounts continued. A woman in her mid-20s said, "On our way, we saw so many killings. Bodies were floating in the water and rivers that we crossed. When women prepared to flee, some wore all their jewelries so that they could bring some valuables with them." She said, "Some of them died en route. I saw dead women lying with these jewelries. However, nobody looted. People just ran and fled for survival. It was like hell. In Mongdo, people were gunned down, villages burned, and so many women were abducted," she added. The refugees also mentioned how local Buddhists routinely targeted and persecuted them. While speaking about the historical trajectory of the conflict, refugees mentioned how long they have been suffering this treatment. A young man in his 20s said, "We had no freedom of movement. Schools were closed, and the Burmese military targeted young people because they suspected they would join the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army." Several other refugees in Bangladesh mentioned how the lack of freedom of movement was so restricting. Another person said, "Going outside in Myanmar was problematic." Others complained that the Mogs took our land. Mog is a term used to depict the local Buddhists in that region, especially in the western part of Myanmar, the Rakhine state. He added, "I lived in a bamboo structure because no bigger or concrete structure was allowed." A woman in her 30s who left her sister and brother back in Myanmar has no idea what happened to them because she's not allowed to communicate with them. She further reiterated, "House arrests were a regular feature in Myanmar. After 6 p.m., we could not venture out. I could not go to the toilet because I was always afraid that the army will find me and torture me." She said, "I heard more accounts of refugees, and they said how children could not go to schools, how violence by the Mogs were a regular feature, and it seemed the Rohingyas always lived in fear. They were routinely harassed and restricted from going to mosques, schools, and markets. If they defied the orders, they were threatened to be killed." As for returning back to Myanmar, all of the refugees I spoke with were reluctant to go back to Myanmar. Some mentioned they were very afraid that they might be killed. Some said there is no point in returning because all is lost. Others said they will only consider returning if their rights are recognized and if justice prevails. Each one of them said how they dread the violence and cannot imagine going back. If there is peace, they will consider going back, but there is no guarantee of it. These accounts are a brief summary of the refugee interviews that indicate the systematic and one-sided nature of violence. And this type of ethnic violence should be identified as genocide. These accounts indicate how long they have endured such discrimination. While these records are indicative of slow motion genocide, it is often difficult to call it by its name. That is a separate problem when establishing the nature of political violence such as this. The refugee accounts, if systematically recorded and analyzed, provide enough evidence, but still this case has not been termed as a clear case of genocide. Let me focus on a more recent event and speak about the issues related to finding the right term to categorize this political violence. It is very important that we analyze the recent events in the context of the past discrimination of the Rohingyas. Also, the refugee accounts should be the basis for evidence and the foundation to establish the case for genocide. While these accounts are helpful to see one-sided violence and how it is perpetuated, and how the victims are devoid of retaliatory capacity, they are also helpful in providing facts that are necessary to categorize ethnic violence. In 2017, when some police posts were attacked by the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army or ARSA, a small rebel group of Rohingyas, the military crackdown was brutal, and the government, along with enclaves of Buddhist nationalists, attacked the Rohingyas indiscriminately. Villages were burnt, women were raped, and several people were killed. Within 2 months, 700,000 Rohingya refugees fled to neighboring Bangladesh. When the United Nations declared it as a catastrophic and the world's fastest growing refugee crisis, and the international media took notice, already the violence reached high intensity. Further reports and fact-finding indicated the genocidal intent of the state of Myanmar. The country's newly elected democratic leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, was severely criticized, and ultimately the events and massive refugee crisis was termed ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is defined as a purposeful policy designed by one ethnic or religious group to remove by violent and terror-inspiring means the civilian population of another ethnic or religious group from certain geographical areas. This is different from genocide. The Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide defines it as any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, such as A, killing members of the group, B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction in whole or in part, D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. While genocide is recognized as a crime in international law, ethnic cleansing is not recognized as an independent crime. This is a critical difference. While many international organizations and news media called Myanmar's Rohingya crisis a genocide, it was termed as ethnic cleansing in 2017 and 2018. However, questions remain, as fact-finding teams are still uncovering the nature of violence in Myanmar. While both these acts of violence are grave, identifying and framing the political conflict is important. In this case, it is closely tied to the future of refugees and state accountability. Myanmar should be held accountable for the crimes against Rohingyas. Ultimately, it is also related to the recognition of their identity and respecting their rights. Recognizing a genocide is not easy because the perpetrator denies it and hides critical evidence. Evidence is important and is telling. A key question is how to gather this evidence. The UN and other human rights organizations have fact-finding teams that collect the evidence, but establishing intent is difficult when states repeatedly deny it. However, it is important to keep digging for evidence. A recent New York Times article published on 6th of October 2020 provides critical evidence of how the atrocities in Myanmar were committed. It focuses on 2 soldiers who confessed their crimes against the Rohingyas. Private Myo Win Tan said in a video testimony that he was following orders. These orders asked him to shoot all you see and all you hear. Another soldier, Private Zo Nain Tan, said he was also following orders that asked him to kill all you see, whether children or adults. Both these generals killed several people and tossed the bodies in mass graves. The location of the graves was corroborated by the Rohingyas. This type of testimonies is rare but vital in uncovering the state's intent. It is the first time that members of the Myanmar military have openly confessed taking part in the genocidal campaign against Rohingya Muslim minority. The 2 soldiers were recently transported to The Hague, where the International Criminal Court of Justice opened a case examining whether the military in Myanmar committed large-scale crimes against the Rohingyas. The crimes and how they are described by the soldiers indicate how systematic, calculated, and one-sided they were. These accounts will also be useful in the ongoing case against Myanmar at the International Court of Justice, as the country is accused of trying to destroy the Rohingya as a group, in whole or in part, by the use of mass murder, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, as well as systematic destruction by fire of the villages. This case was filed by Gambia on behalf of 57-nation Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Recently, Netherlands and Canada announced that they would provide legal support to this effort of holding Myanmar accountable for genocide. Such concerted effort by states are important in establishing justice and upholding international norms. Bill Freilich suggests that we should look closely at the patterns of persecution by the state in establishing this intent. When states repeatedly deny this, refugee testimonials are the measure of genocide in the making and how violence was systematically used. These refugee accounts are sometimes the only information that provides details about what happened, how, when, and why. My purpose was to attain this with the refugee interviews that I have conducted. My field research in Bangladesh's refugee camps was divided into two phases. In July 2018, I conducted approximately 40 interviews for my research in Cox's Bazar in southern part of Bangladesh. And then in December 2018, I conducted in-depth interviews with 10 more refugees for a documentary film to highlight their experiences and their challenges, the violence they experienced, and how they live in the camps. Let me share a map with you to show the location of the refugee camps. So here in this map, you see the southern part of Bangladesh right here, and this is the western part of Myanmar. And here, these green circles are the location of the refugee camps. Taken as a whole, this is considered the world's largest refugee camps. Within this area, the biggest area is this one, the Kutupalang expansion. This is where I conducted most of the interviews, although I did visit and talk to refugees in Nayapara extension in the southern tip of Bangladesh. Also, I want to talk to you about the geography of the place. This border region, especially in the southern area, is very hilly and densely forested. And then there is this river called Naf River, which you can see here, which is a huge river and pretty treacherous. The refugees spoke about how difficult it was for them to cross these hills and dense forest because most of them came by foot from the villages in Myanmar located here into Bangladesh. Some of them got stranded here by the bank of this river, and they had to take cramped boats to cross the river and ultimately come into Bangladesh. But they said that they had no choice because at the top of their mind, survival was key. I now proceed to the second part of my presentation. And in this second part of my presentation, I show the documentary film. This documentary is an attempt to share what I saw in the refugee camps and present the refugee accounts. Also, it highlights the existing and ongoing crisis of the refugees and countries like Bangladesh. I now invite you to watch the film, and I look forward to discussing key issues with you afterwards. Just before the question and answer session, I would like to make an observation about my field research. Now, as I mentioned before, my field research was divided into two phases. The first phase was conducted in the summer of 2018, around July and August. And then after around 6 months, I went back in December of 2018. Now, my experiences of talking to the refugees was very different because during the first phase, when I was speaking to the refugees, when they were talking about their experiences and when they were describing what happened to them, they never used the word rights or justice or anything of that sort. And that was only, they expressed that only when I went back in December with the span of 6 months. And I thought of why they did not use this term rights and justice during the summer. And upon observation, upon further research, I found that during the 6 months, the refugees got a lot of information about what it means to be Rohingyas and how the international world is perceiving them. Before in Myanmar, they lived a very insulated kind of life where they didn't understand how to claim their rights. I mean, there were certain groups of people which I mentioned, these Rohingya Salvation Army, but that was, not the whole entire population of Rohingyas. That was just a section of the Rohingyas. And during the 6 months, the refugees got a chance to talk with international organizations. They got a chance to talk about, they saw what was written about them in international media using internet and phones. And the whole conversation about rights, about their demands, about their identity was very different when I went back in December. And I just thought of mentioning that before we start talking about Ask Me questions and any discussions that you might have.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya. Thank you very much. Before we open for the discussion, as Morgan, as you commented here, please note on the chat if you have a question, and please try to just keep it short so we can move on. So please.
How was the crisis portrayed by international news media? Was the coverage fair and accurate? Could it have been better?
I mean, it is a very interesting question and a complex one, because international media in the immediate aftermath of 2017 was split. And I'm saying split because we have the Western media and we have the media in Southeast Asia region. Western media was very sympathetic to the Rohingya cause. But however, South and Southeast Asian news outlets, especially given my experience analyzing Indian news media, they were not at all very sympathetic towards Rohingyas. In fact, they used derogatory terms like terrorists to depict them. So I would say that it was split. There was a general kind of understanding of the crisis, and the Western media did a phenomenal job of making it urgent. But then again, there was this other side of the world that was not looking favorably towards them.
My question really is, in relation to the ethnic violence versus genocide of the Rohingyas. If this has been going on for decades and a very long time, and the victims all have a very similar congruent story, how is it that they're not seeing it as a genocide when everybody seems to be unanimous about what is going on?
Thank you, Heather. That's a very important question. I'll try to answer it to the best of my ability, but I don't think I have the full answer to this. When I was researching this topic of genocide and ethnic conflict, ethnic violence, I found that genocide has this kind of urgency. And when we think about genocide, there are these visions of the genocide that are used as stereotypical representation of genocide, like the Holocaust, like the Rwandan genocide. Those were episodes that kind of immediately tells you the number of people who died, under what conditions they died. But there are different levels of genocide that might not look like Rwandan genocide, or that might not look like Holocaust. but might have the same mechanisms of how it was perpetrated over the years. This is where that's why I brought this new understanding of genocide, the slow motion genocide or cold genocide. What we understand as kind of genocide with these perceptions of Holocaust and Rwandan genocide is hot genocides, meaning the urgency is palpable. However, in the case of slow motion genocide, this immediate number of brutal killings are not visible to us, although it is happening for a long time. And then, of course, although I use this term in my documentary, ethnic cleansing, these type of terms are confusing in kind of establishing the political violence as genocide. And I use this term ethnic cleansing in the documentary because of the time that I was making it. But right now, if you ask me, I will absolutely categorically say that this is genocide. And given my research, I would say that ultimately this ethnic cleansing, this term should be, it should not be used. We should get rid of this term because that colludes our understanding of genocide. It's a very complex kind of situation, And of course, there are repercussions, as I said. How is the international law going to see this? How the state is going to be made accountable? How willing are other international actors in stating that this is genocide or not? I hope that I have answered a little bit of your question, but and maybe in while talking about other questions and answering other questions, I'll think more about it and get back to you.
Dr. Morris has just a brief comment or addition. Dr. Morris?
Well, I think thank you for your film. It was very powerful and your talk has been fantastic. What I thought Heather's question was, because I had the same question, in the early part of your talk before the film, you were saying that part of the reason that it hasn't been regarded internationally as genocide is because the leaders haven't acknowledged it, and hence you can't prove intent. But I think what Heather was saying and what I was thinking is, I don't know that we need the leaders' consent to prove intent, that there's so many ways to dig at and get at intent that waiting, right? And so I guess I don't know, that was I may be misstating Heather's question, but that's what it was making me think about, right? That why would we need the leader's consent to prove intent? That's not really how, right? Like we'll be waiting until heck freezes over, waiting for that, right?
Thank you, Christina, for this clarification. This is very, very helpful to kind of, again, understand this very complex nature of genocide and when to declare it as a genocide. And you're right, you're absolutely right. Why do we need to really rely on the perpetrators when they're never going to share the intent, although the evidence is there? However, I think in the case of Myanmar, Myanmar's history, part of Myanmar's history and the key to understanding this genocide, what happened in the 1990s, what happened in the early 2000s are missing, because during that time there was censorship in Myanmar, right? International media couldn't get in to really dig this evidence and bring it out, but it was there. It was absolutely there. And the 2017 episode, it brought it back to the surface. And of course, it was the democratization and people had more access, and Myanmar was seen as a model, which kind of actually was partly a good thing and partly what was also came to a point where it bit them in their back, because the opening up, the democratization also meant information is being shared. We got to know what is happening to this Rohingyas at that time. And then people started unpacking what is happening for years, the historical context, it's all there, And of course, when we're talking about a military regime and genocidal accounts also, the intent, and sometimes in certain cases of genocide, the perpetrators are, for some reason, they record what they have done, but in a very warped kind of manner, So how do we kind of dig out this information and present it, analyze it. I think that is critical here. And again, I don't have the full answer. I am still researching and sharing these type of information, calling it by its name is the thing that comes to my mind immediately, you know. And moving on from there, we can see what can be done.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to thank Professor Ade for the beautiful film. I just want to ask about the as you have mentioned within the film and before the film, you had the presentation. We have seen that there's Rohingya. Majority of them are out of the country. Around 725,000. Another thing, they lost citizenship rights. They don't have land. And when you read, you see that the land they had in their own country, in Myanmar, was given to other ethnic groups. There is also, Myanmar is not a party member of Rome Statute. What do you think about the remaining solution for this case of Rohingya? Since because we don't see the legal solution, it looks impossible because of limited investigation, and you see China is a friend of Myanmar, and when there is this intervention of UN security, there might be veto from China. I mean, what is the remaining solution for this case of? What do you think is the remaining solution for this case of Rohingya, for them to be allowed to be given their identity? Thank you very much.
Thank you, John Paul, for your questions. I think you have asked several very important key questions, and I'll try to address each of them. First things first, you asked me what will happen to this near million refugees that are in Bangladesh. And just to add on to that, there are more who are scattered in Southeast Asian countries, in Malaysia, in Thailand, in other parts of Southeast Asia. And these are refugees that went to these countries due to past violence in the 1990s. And so we are talking about a whole group of people who are scattered outside, demanding these rights and identity. And this is a very worthwhile question. Now, legally, because of the sheer number of people, and because being a refugee forever is not, a thing that the Rohingyas want, everybody's attention is towards Myanmar, because what is the right thing to do? That Myanmar accepts that they have committed this crime and then they give them the rights. But that is not going to happen. If you look at the historical context of how the government of Myanmar and the majority of people talk about Rohingyas, they are not at all interested in giving these people rights and bringing them back as citizens of Myanmar. In fact, in some of the reports that I have read, this was before 2015, where state officials have said that Rohingyas are not our problem. In fact, we want them to leave our country and become other countries' problem. And they are very blatant about it. So given this type of thought process about how they think these Rohingyas are, it is not very promising to kind of rely on Myanmar. In addition to it, talks of repatriation have been going on because Bangladesh has been very clear. They said that in the beginning it is okay because it's a humanitarian crisis, we have allowed these people to come in. But in the long run, Bangladesh cannot really sustain this and support them because Bangladesh, the country itself, is a developing country, has their own issues, and is already burdened. So they wanted to have negotiations with Myanmar and arrange this repatriation. 2 attempts of repatriation happened in 2018 and 2019. The attempts failed because repatriation needs to be voluntary, in the sense that the refugees have to agree to be repatriated, and then they can be returned. If they do not want to, they cannot be forced to do that. But this repatriation didn't work because the refugees in the camps, all of them protested. They said, we are not going to go. And in fact, in my second phase of the field research, I saw within these camps, there were other camps. They were called repatriation camps. And when I went there, these camps were all empty. And I asked around that, what are these things? What are these camps? They said that these are repatriation camps. And at one point of time, thousands of Rohingyas were put there because they were being prepared to be repatriated. But there were protests happening in the camps. And of course, the UNHCR was there. They helped the refugees. So the repatriation did not work and it was stopped. What is the solution? So I think another solution is, if you ask me, is that countries in South and Southeast Asia need to be negotiating with themselves and come up with this solution of third-party resettlement. It cannot be one country's burden, like Bangladesh right now. The burden has to be shared. However, problems are there. India, which is now a Hindu nationalist kind of country and ruled by this Hindu nationalist political party, is vehemently opposed to kind of giving any kind of residence to Rohingyas. So, but India is one of the prominent players in Southeast Asia. Other countries have taken some refugees, but there is no concerted effort in creating a formal dialogue. In addition, you saw in the latter half of my documentary, this particular island, which is a very new island that has come up with no such geographical security. And as recent as September of 2020, I read that some of the refugees are now being moved to that island. Whether they are doing it voluntarily or not, we don't know. But they have been promised different accommodation and they have been transferred there. But that's not a long-term solution. So, in other words, your question is a very valid one, but we don't know what will happen to these refugees unless there is a regional cooperation and a concerted effort to solve this problem.
Thank you, Srobana, for the excellent presentation. You actually already touched upon one of my questions, and that was the larger Southeast Asian context and what if any, the other countries and the bigger players like India, which obviously now is sort of in a very precarious position in terms of disenfranchising minority rights themselves, but the larger Southeast Asian context for creating a framework for refugees is perhaps the will is missing. So my other question related to that was, is perhaps the refugee, the UN refugee law itself needs a little bit of revamping now, because how has it helped the refugees in terms of what their rights are, and where is it falling short? Because this kind of offshoring to an island is not just an idea in Bangladesh, but it's a similar idea that Australia has done. So I guess this is a bigger thematic question. Is that refugee law up for revisiting, and is it failing the current conditions that we're seeing in terms of conflict around the world?
Thank you very much, Ramya, for this question. I think this is, again, a very valid question. And as you mentioned, the United Nations refugee law, the law already asks countries to kind of burden share or kind of come together and cooperate. And some countries are part of this, they are signatories to this law. However, when it comes to the practical kind of, addressing of the situation, countries falter. So the question is, if they are part of the legal framework and upholding of international norms, how are they standing by their own position, right? So I think there is a bigger conversation needs to be done as far as what it means to be a signatory, what it means to be based on that kind of membership, what are the duties of the countries. So it seems like the countries should be forced to take action. And as recently as the summer of 2020, again, we have seen groups of Rohingyas stranded in Bay of Bengal and Andaman Sea en route to Malaysia and Indonesia and Southeast Asia, because they are becoming frustrated in these refugee camps. They need a sustainable environment where they are kind of trying to figure out the next phase of their life. They need economic dependence and independence, and they are trying to figure out where they need to go. And I actually interviewed some refugees in India as well. This was not part of this conversation today. And they are also these, they have become refugees who are traveling from one country to the other. Within the country, they're going from one camp to the other, searching for the next step. And this is happening because the countries are failing to uphold what their exact position is. Definitely, I think we need to revisit the criteria of this law, the framework of the law, and what it means to be part of it. And as far as duties are concerned, what countries can do.
So Irvin's having some trouble with his mic, so I'll ask his question for him. Irvin's question was, did Aung San Suu Kyi come up in any of your conversations with the Rohingya refugees?
She did come up in one of the refugees. He was very much vehemently opposed to Aung San Suu Kyi, and he said it. It's recorded. It's part of a different kind of project that I have. He said that Aung San Suu Kyi with other kind of military personnel should be put under trial, because then they will be able to justify or and try to figure out what it means to be a Rohingya refugee. He wanted the whole world to understand what it means to be a Rohingya refugee. And he said that unless and until we bring these people under trial, make them accountable for what they have done, justice will not be done. So he actually appealed on camera that I am appealing to the world to give us justice, and I'm appealing to the world to put them under trial. But this is, one voice among many. And the problem is that these voices are drowned very easily rather than brought back up in surface.
So I had a question, or common question, I guess, about the democratic transition, that really the current kind of the wave of violence that began in 2012, right, followed immediately on the democratic transition. Of course, we have a head of state who then wins a Nobel Peace Prize, right? And I wonder if you can talk a bit about how those issues about country perpetrating genocide, but just had just undergone a transition to democracy, right? And also with the Peace Prize, the head of state, what role does that play in the kind of abandonment of Rohingya refugees, right? And also, what does it tell us about, what do you think that it tells us about, if we need to, we just talked a bit about the need to revisit UN refugee legal framework, right? But maybe, I think that one of the things that come out of your work, your film, and your lecture is that we really need to think about ways of promoting the voices, rather than looking at the perspective of the state and the international system, which is also the state, right? But rather the perspectives of the victims and the voices of the survivors and the refugees, who also actually, I assume, and I'd like to see if you can maybe also say something about that. Not only they don't want to return, as we've seen, but how do they actually see the solution How do they articulate their identity? You know, what do they suggest in terms of looking to the future? Yeah.
Thank you, Raj. I will start with your last question, and then I'll move to the other questions that you have asked. As far as the refugees and what do they see as the solution, overall, I would say that most of the refugees were very afraid of what they have seen, the levels of violence. But at the same time, I could see that as human beings, they were split, because Myanmar, after all, whether it was accepting of their identity or not, was home for them. That's where they grew up, and that's what they know as far as land is concerned, as far as home is concerned. But it so happened that the home that they kind of know rejected them. And it was it was very heartbreaking to see these two sides in this human being. One is that I want to go back home, but I can't because they have taken everything and I will be killed. And this whole idea of being floating as if you are a nobody in a foreign soil, because and some of those sentiments came up in the film, where they are saying that I want to go back, but I can't go back. And this tension was everywhere. I mean, I observed in the camp, when I was talking to people, this tension was there, you know, that I have a home, but I can't go home. I have been ousted from home, and I don't know who I am, where I belong. And so some of them did say that we don't want to go home, but we want to go to a better country, in the sense that many of them said, I want to go to India, because in India, they see that the economic opportunities are more. And some of the refugees, older refugees, have made their way to India, and they get the information from these refugees that they're doing well, or something is different from how they are trapped as refugees. Some of them said that, can we go to countries like the United States? What is the procedure of going to the United States? And I had to tell them that I am not a legal expert, and neither am I in the position to tell you how to go to the United States. I'm a researcher. But some of them wanted an out, because it was not possible for them to sustain themselves. Some of them also said that they are missing family members. These family members just took off to Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia, and they told their family members that we are going to get a job, and once we get a job, we are going to come back, take you, or we are going to send money. And they have not heard back from these people. And 1 year, 2 years have passed. They have not heard back from these people. So there is this urgency of finding a better solution. There is this urgency of justice and the rights, but they are not very sure how to articulate it. And there is always this tension of what is home and how can I find it back? So it is confusing, a very complex kind of sentiment that they have. As far as your question regarding the democratic process, or the democratization that happened in around 2015-16, and as you said, previous to that, 2012, we had these violent episodes. I think those violent episodes, again, there was urgency, there was media attention, and I think some of the human rights organizations already called it at that time, that it was a genocide. But it got kind of buried. Maybe it was because of the election. And then again, the election was seen as, the symbol of bringing in more inclusion rather than exclusion. But it went completely haywire, because Aung San Suu Kyi was seen as this harbinger of democracy, a democratic symbol. And I think the Western community put a lot of hope in her, saying that if she comes in power, we are going to create a model for Southeast Asia. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. And Aung San Suu Kyi surprised all of us, because if you look at her trajectory of coming to power, she has been under house arrest for 15 years, from late 1990s. So she struggled to create this democratic platform, but once she came in power, she was not able to tackle or manage this particular problem that was ongoing for years. And I think that it is strategic on her part. She didn't want to take an action against the Rohingyas because she was afraid that she's going to lose out her support in Myanmar, and whatever gains she had made as far as democracy is concerned, that all will be lost. But at the same time, not addressing this issue and saying that the international community doesn't understand the local context of what is happening in Myanmar is just definitely brushing the whole genocidal intent under the carpet. Of course, there was much more that needed to be done. There was a lot of promise, but it was a complete failure on her part to really uphold true nature of democracy. And third thing I would like to say, and I think you have made a very important point about my work on this issue, is looking at it from the victim side. Yes, that's exactly what I want to do. And in my research, I'm still doing research. No way I know everything about genocide. In my research, I have seen that the most attention is focused always on the perpetrator, on the state, what has they done historically, who have been the main players. But what I felt is that the victims are often kind of relegated in the background, when the victims themselves can be voiced to understanding the processes of conflict. I mean, in many cases of genocide, victims are not there. They die in the process. But those who live in the form of refugees are really our one particular section of the population that can help us understand what is happening as far as genocide is concerned.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It's been very insightful. My question is, if you could discuss how the current COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the Rohingyas' rights in refugee camps, and also how it's impacted global attention on the issue.
Thank you very much, Tori. This is a very important question. And I would like to take you back to some of the images of the film. If you remember the structures of the huts and the kind of accommodations, they were very close together, right? One on the other, and it was very vast. At the same time, everybody was in close quarters. Personal space, and especially social distancing, as we know right now, is impossible to imagine in that kind of close quarters. So I think the biggest challenge that has happened in the wake of COVID-19 is to establish this social distancing norms in the camp. Now, I have been trying to find as much as I can as far as understanding how COVID-19 has affected the camps, but the information, unfortunately, is limited, and I'm not sure why that is the case. However, from the limited information that I gathered, it seems like international organizations are working round the clock to establish the principles of creating the right hygiene, social distancing, and so on. Now, once they are establishing these rules, what happens is that the refugees, they're already constrained in this camp, right? Now they are constrained all the more. I read in one recent interview, this person was saying how COVID-19 has affected life in camps. And he said that the biggest thing that we are being affected with, that we now have to really be inside these accommodations with all our family members. We cannot step outside whenever we want to. There are strict regulations of where we can go, when we can go there. So we are living in close quarters almost all the time. So we are feeling very, very restricted. In addition to it, I think he also mentioned, I don't know whether this is related to COVID-19 or not, he said that the internet situation in the refugee camp is very sketchy, meaning there has been blockouts of the internet is not available to the refugees. And the refugee said that we feel very restricted, and since we cannot access the internet, we have no idea what is happening as far as COVID-19 is concerned. So we feel that information is being cut off and we are not getting access to it. Third thing that he said is that due to this feeling of restriction, a lot of refugees are trying to flee the camp. And some of them were fleeing this camp to go to other countries by boat. And these boats were stranded, and the Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia and everything, they said that they are not willing to take these refugees. So it's a very precarious situation. And especially with COVID-19, their feeling of restriction has heightened. And there are cases in the camp and they are trying to regulate it. However, it's very difficult.
I was interested in humanitarian aid and how much that's getting interfered with, how much is really getting to them, and what happens when they're constantly having these sort of natural disasters or whatever with their housing, with their accommodations. What is the level of humanitarian aid that's getting to them?
Thank you, Mary. When I went there, in addition to what I saw, as far as the conditions of how the refugees were living and how many refugees are there, something that stood out to me was how many international organizations and non-governmental organizations were present. They were working around the clock, 24/7. And so I asked around, I said, how many organizations are there? Who can volunteer? Where are all these people coming from? And in fact, during my travel to Bangladesh from India, I met many aid workers who were going there as part of UNHCR, as part of other international organizations. And based on the report that I read, there were at that time almost more than 100 international organizations working there. So you can imagine the breadth of it. There was a lot of aid that is coming, humanitarian aid that is coming in, but the major player, I would say, was UNHCR. And UNHCR is headquartered in Cox's Bazar, which is the town in southern Bangladesh. And what they have done is UNHCR has collaborated with local Bangladesh government in that area, and they have taken over these massive buildings and built their offices. So that has become their headquarters. In conjunction with UNHCR, the local organization or the government affiliated organization that works in Bangladesh is the Refugee Repatriation Commission. The Refugee Repatriation Commission is closely aligned with UNHCR, but their work, they are limited in how many people are working there and limited in what they can do because of funding. But again, to answer your question, there are several, more than hundreds of international organizations working there.
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya, for your research and presentation. I have 3 questions for you. And the first one is, in the light of what's happening in India today with the CAA bill that has come into act, how do you see India in the days to come with its majoritarian worldview that's happening in Indian society? That's my first question for you. The second thing is, when you have interviewed these refugees, what did they feel about justice? What is their understanding about justice? Because they said that, as you mentioned, that they want justice to be done, but what is their understanding about justice? That's my second question. And the third question is, in your trips to these refugee camps at Bangladesh and dealing with these people, Rohingyas, have you ever felt that there are certain areas that need to be researched? Or what are the areas that are not touched so far? Or are there any new areas that need to be researched in relation to these refugees' lifestyle or their future or aspirations or religious research or whatever, if you have felt anything of that sort? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Varun. I'll take your first question. What is the standpoint of India, especially given its kind of exclusive bill, the CEA bill. The biggest challenge for the Rohingyas, as far as India is concerned, is acceptance. Because as I said before, the sentiment of Hindu nationalism is so very high in India right now. And that is heightened by Prime Minister Modi. And they have been very, blatant about how they're categorizing the Muslim minority, not only in India, but outside of India. That has been a bone of contention in how society is dealing with this rising Hindu nationalism in India. Now, when I was in India and Bangladesh during my research, this was 2018, and also I've been keeping tab on 2019, the overall sentiment was very hostile because they knew that there will be an exodus of refugees from Bangladesh in the long term into India, because Bangladesh is our next door neighbor, and there has been historically this migration that happens from Bangladesh to India. And given the sheer amount of refugees in Bangladesh, it is inevitable at some point or the other that some refugees, some of these Rohingyas will make inroads into India. And in fact, we do have big refugee camps in the northern part of India, in the southern part of India. And as I said, the sentiment for these people was very derogatory. In fact, some of my friends, after I came back to India, after doing research in Bangladesh, they directly asked me that these people that you interviewed are the terrorists. So it was very disheartening to hear these type of comments from your own people when you have just gone and talked to these refugees. So I took some time to make them understand what I saw in the best possible way, but you cannot explain what you see in these refugee camps unless you stand there and talk to these people, So it's very, very difficult. So the overall sentiment, I would say, is very hostile, not towards Rohingyas who are outside of India right now, but for the Muslim minority in India. The second one I'm going to talk about is your question related to when the refugees were talking about justice, what did they mean? Justice was an umbrella term that they used. Many people lost their land because, as I mentioned, the villages were burnt. They don't have a home to go back to. So for these people, justice meant that if we go back, will they give us back our land? Will I get back my home? Or will I get back my property or whatever is that has been taken by the government? The second aspect of justice is the acknowledgement of being a human being. That am I recognized as a human being? Am I recognized as based on my identity? Why do I need to justify my identity? Why do I need to be identified as an illegal migrant when I don't have anything, I haven't done anything illegal? I have been there in Myanmar forever, but now I have to prove or in fact flee my country because I'm not recognized. So I think that is of being a human being. And the third one, I think, is the level of violence that they have seen or experienced. That how can people do this type of violence to others without getting any punishment? So that's the justice that they want, that they have done something wrong. Now they need to be punished for it. But this, again, was very difficult kind of acknowledgement on their part. It was not the case when I went there in the summer of 2018. They never talked about it. It was, I think the emotion was very raw at that time. But over 6 months, things changed. And their acknowledgement of their own human identity kind of came up. The third question that you asked is, given my observation of the refugee camps, what area of research should be done? I think one big area of research that needs to be done is the psychological impact of violence, abuse on groups of people like Rohingyas. We don't talk about it. So I'm sure, and the children, and again, something I noticed in my first field visit is the faces of the children. I cannot explain it to you. You know, the faces of the children were like they were like stones. And when we see children are, you know, spontaneous, they are intuitive. But when I saw these children, their face as if something has struck them, they're in shock. And that means that there is severe psychological trauma. And this element of trauma needs to be analyzed, especially children and women. And women were talking about how their bodies were manhandled, abused by the military. And it was, again, devastating to listen to it as being a woman listening to another person, experiencing that. And then in 6 months, children are very resilient. In fact, all these refugees are so resilient. It's inspiring to see that. Within 6 months, when I went back, the faces of children changed. They were smiling, they were kind of, you know, interacting with me, and there was a lot of effort in schooling them and everything. So I was very intrigued to see this change. And so I wanted to understand the psychological trauma aspect of it.
Thank you so much for your research and your presentation. To follow up on Mary's question, are humanitarian organizations providing any mental health services for Rohingya refugees? And also, are humanitarian organizations offering educational curriculum and materials to children to address mental health? Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much, Amanda. Yes, I think the organizations that are present there are doing a lot to address the trauma that has been experienced by these people, and they have done it based on different sections of the population. I have seen during my time in the camps that there are separate kind of congregation groups that are helping only women, and there are separate groups that are helping pregnant women. There are certain groups that are helping women that have experienced violence. So they are taking it as per the experiences of women and where they are at in their life. So that was something which stood out. At the same time, as far as research is concerned, and to kind of analyze where it is going from there, getting access to this type of topic is difficult, because as many of you know, that you need to have certain kind of approval, like a human subjects ethical board approval, to gain access to and talk to these people. And it has to be done in such a way that it is ethical and there is consent, in the sense that these people should be willing to talk to you. Now, because of the sensitivity of the issue of trauma related to violence and sexual abuse in women, getting access to this group of people and culling that data is very difficult. I saw that they are doing a lot of work. That was not the issue, but what type of work is happening? How are they rehabilitating these people? What is the timeline of these people, of how these women are recovering, if at all, from this type of trauma, is something that needs to be done and done over time. As far as education is concerned, yes, the international organizations have created these schools, and students are getting basic access to education. At the same time, there is struggle for infrastructure, because it is still not yet there. They're trying very hard. There are hospitals, even in this refugee camp, there are state-of-the-art hospitals, and the UNHCR has brought in equipment, generator, and everything. There is no electricity in the camps, but for the hospital units, they have established certain kind of electricity generators and everything, and trying to help the Rohingyas.
Did some people not want to appear in the documentary because of concerns of being targeted or recognized?
Interestingly enough, I didn't encounter any people who didn't want to be in the documentary. In fact, they wanted all the more, because they wanted people to hear their stories. The only people that they didn't want to be in the documentary are some women who were shy in front of the camera, and this is where being a woman and talking to a woman really helped. The moment I understood that they don't want to be in front of the camera, I said, no, you don't have to be. So I moved elsewhere because I did not want to force them to be in front of the camera. None of these people were. Everybody actually came and said, can I talk? They wanted to talk. Can I say a few words?
Of course, please.
I want to thank you, wholeheartedly thank you for being here. And this is a great number of people present on Zoom. And, I was a little disheartened when this whole COVID thing happened, but it was definitely not in my control because I was not sure how to share the work that I have done, because the whole attempt of doing it was to share it with the bigger audience, because I wanted to show you what I saw in the camp, because it is very difficult to understand unless you are there or somebody tells you in a capacity that you are able to understand a little bit. So a heartfelt thanks to you, because you are here, present with me, and I am able to talk to you about this issue. The whole thing was to give the voice to the refugees.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhattacharya. I think we learned a lot, many issues and questions to consider on this very, very important case of genocide and refugees, and through it thinking about refugees more broadly. So many thanks, and very much looking forward to your further work on this topic. Thank you very much.
Very welcome, and thank you.